Hi there, I'm Paul Carrigan here with Matthew Kay, one of the founding English teachers at the Science Leadership Academy in Philadelphia, and author of this extraordinary new book, Not Light But Fire, How to Lead Meaningful Race Conversations in the Classroom, which we're going to talk about. Thanks for joining me, Matt.
Oh, no problem. Thanks for having me.
In your introduction, you describe the situation that we have repeatedly in the U.S. and it's happening right now with the blackface scandal in Virginia, where something racist happens, and then we all talk about race for a minute, and then we move on, nothing having changed, and you call it on page 2. You talk about empty rhetoric and thoughtless repetition. So I want to know what makes typical race conversations so superficial, and then you also say in the same passage, or page later, same section, we never seem to graduate to the next conversation. So what makes usual conversation so superficial, and how would the next conversation look different?
Well, I think that there's more than a few things that make them superficial, but I think that the biggest observation is that we don't want to do that much work when we have our race conversations. We don't want to spend, it's a lot of effort listening to somebody and taking in a different perspective, or challenging the things we believe, or finding complications, or doing research, or finding historical context, or any of the many things that we want our students to be able to do eventually. They're hard work. And it's so much easier to make a meme. It's so much easier to fire off a tweet. It's so much easier to get into the circle of people who agree with you and just preach to the choir. And while I think there's a place for that sometimes, I think generally the public discourse is just lazy. And I think we model that a lot of times for the young people that we work with, is that race conversations require very little effort. And we need to do a better job than that.
So what would the next conversation look like if we move past what is? Step 1, work harder. Step 2.
Well,
yeah, what would that look like?
Work harder. If it goes throughout. It depends. It's case by case. It's conversation by conversation. But I think, as you see in my book, I make a very big deal about listening and the hard work that goes into listening. It is fascinating to me how bad we are at listening to each other. The more you think about it. And so I think a continued step is to continue asking yourself, what more can I learn about this situation? What more can I learn about what the other people in this room think, even though I don't agree with them? What more can I learn about what I think? What's the history? Who else has thought like this? How did it end up for them? What were the comments that they made? And et cetera, et cetera. Basically applying the same rigor that we do to other disciplines, but to race conversations.
I love that. I think one of the central insights of your book is the topic of chapter 1, of demystifying the safe space. So you say we can't just declare a space safe and then make it safe. That we actually have to do the work of building trust with one another. Starting, for instance, that the safe space is not just an attitude or aspiration. There's like practical steps we can take to build trust. Starting with listening, which you just talked about. I think it's a temptation often for us to want to get to the meat of the discussion. Like, here's the juicy part, here's the controversial part, here's the ideas. But we can't just rush to that. We have to do this ground building, foundation laying work of making sure we trust each other first, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and I can understand why we are that way. I mean, not just Hollywood. I talk about Hollywood in the book, but it's not just Hollywood. It's in all of our ed conversations when we were in school, and everything's about teachable moment, and everything is about getting us to have the conversation right then and in the moment. And so if something big is going on in the world, we got to talk about it the next day if we really care about our kids. If something's going on in the hallways, we got to talk about it the next hour if we really care about our kids. And there's this constant implication that if we're not hurrying, we're not doing it right. And I really want to push back against that and say sometimes, and actually not sometimes, most of the times, if we're hurrying, that's when we're getting something wrong. And we need to develop relationships with our students before we have some of these conversations. Otherwise, we're just assuming that we've built relationships that we haven't built. And it's like, how much money do we pay marriage counselors to tell us that we should listen more to our significant you know, that we should, you know, if you say that you love her, then I mean, what have you done to show that, et cetera, et cetera? Like, how many times have you told her she's beautiful? How many of you told him he's handsome or he's smart or she's smarter? Like, have you put in the work, or are you just saying it? And with our students, it's the same way. We keep saying, you can trust me. This is a safe space. But what have we done to show that? It's something we should always be thinking about.
So I think the other most important point in the book is your exhortation to get students to the hard conversations, which is to push past where everyone just trots out the usual positions, where you can already predict what everybody's going to say. And I'm thinking there's a couple places where you say that especially clearly. Like on 126, you say encourage new lines of inquiry. So we've already heard the two binary positions that everybody says. Let's explore something new. And then on 98, you say it this way: to seek hard problems to inspire unpredictable exchanges. I just thought that's such a useful, and I've already begun practicing that in my own courses. Another place you say that's related to this is that if my end game is simply for my students to see inequality, I'm operating short of my students' potential. I haven't presented the hard problem. And so I'm thinking, I just led a conversation yesterday about the blackface scandal in Virginia. And I think my old habit would have been to say, here's the scandal, what do you think? And then to argue with the students who say it's no big deal, because it is a big deal. But with your exhortation, instead of just what do you think, I ask, like, okay, why did they do that? Why were some people upset about it? Why did other people not care that people were offended? How did this man get to medical school and not know the history of this? And I think these kinds of questions are a lot more interesting. That they're harder. I don't have an answer to them already. Than is this okay?
Mm-hmm. Well, I was just having a conversation with a colleague about this earlier. In a nutshell, we were talking about the nature of privilege, in that a lot of our white students, when they leave our classes, in 2-3 years, when they're out of our school, they can choose a college that doesn't have these conversations, and they can live a life that doesn't have these conversations. And what are we doing in our classrooms to make it so that they more often than not will opt into difficult, challenging, engaging conversations about race. Our brown kids won't have much of a choice. That's the life that they're going to live. I have different challenges for them, but for white students, I'm thinking they'll get the opportunity very soon to opt out of all conversations about race that make them uncomfortable or that make them, that they just don't want to participate in. And so a challenge for me is to make race discourse, to present race course as the interesting thing that it is, and the multifaceted thing that it is, and make it so it's something that's worthy. Like if you're really smart, you feel like this is a worthy use for your brain. I think when we unnecessarily simplify the conversation into clear-cut right and wrongs. Now, sometimes there are clear-cut right and wrongs. I'm not saying there's not, sometimes things are just wrong or they are just racist and those things. But when that becomes the end of the conversation and not not just a point, I think we get to a place where kids who have the privilege to check out will live pretty checked out lives. We won't be modeling that this is something that they should be engaged in. And so we got to get all the juice out of the conversation. We got to get all the complexity. We got to get all the interesting stuff out to encourage these habits of mind and willingness to engage the topic thoughtfully. And so, when we go for hard problems, kids like problems. They like puzzles. They like feeling like, hey, this is the same conversations that are being debated in, the Senate or the school board or the House or the important people in academia are having this conversation, and you're 15 and you're having this conversation. You're having the same conversation, a bit scaffolded, but you're having the same conversation, and that's worthy of your intelligence and input.
I love that. It has, I think, just so many benefits. The motivational one that you mentioned, the fact that we're not stopping too short, right? That okay, it's wrong to be racist. Well, we already know that. Let's move past that. So I just really am helped by that point. Another thing that struck me pretty powerfully was what you called the Jeffersonian dismissal on 79. So you quote something pretty racist that Jefferson says, and then you say that in race conversations and in teaching about race, we have to kind of reject the trend or move past the trend to make kind of racism the only story that gets told about race, to avoid, quote, race discussion that is solely racism centered. And I've been feeling this before, but you phrased it so well. And I'm thinking about, I teach literature, African American literature, canonical African American literature is like a lot of literatures, kind of predominantly dark in its themes, and it really does. A lot of the great texts do emphasize racism and the struggle against racism more than other themes. And so I'm wondering if you can help me think of some more ways to not have that be the whole conversation. I was thinking maybe we need to pair like African American literature, the canonical texts, with like Black sitcoms that perhaps show a broader spectrum of what could be talked about when we're talking about race.
I think it's important for us to just accept that challenge, and I think there's a lot of people who, weigh in on that. And but it's just to accept the challenge, and I feel it all the time. Like I'm always, when I'm reading a book, for example, in about a month or so, I'm gonna start teaching Native Son, and I know I have a chapter in Not Light but Fire about Native Son. One of the conversations I have there, but I'm about to teach it, and I'm always trying to find, I'm always trying to color my conversation with all manner of human questions, and so that brown people are being presented as more than just people who have to overcome white people.
Yeah.
And so, for example, when I used to teach fences, August Wilson, there's a clear, he's the main character is held back by racism, without a doubt. That family lives in a situation that they do because racism and the Negro Leagues and all of those things. But also that's a play about family and what happens when dreams get deferred and hopes get dashed in families, and what are the roles we put on fathers and sons and all of these conversations. And I say, I need to talk about the Black family when I'm teaching fences, not just what racism has done. I need to talk about the pressures that broken dreams put on marriages when I have this conversation. Because Black people are like white people in that regard, because people are people in that regard, while still making time for conversations about racism. And if I'm teaching Native Son, it's about racism. So we're definitely going to talk about racism. But just finding those moments where I can, look at a text and see what's going on here, that I can show the humanity and amplify the humanity in whatever conflicts are there. What other conflicts are there? What other challenges and problems are there? And when you're not talking about challenges and problems, finding moments where you just celebrate Black culture, Indian culture, Asian culture, celebrate it, and have your show and tells and your moments, like in the name chapter in the book, where you just celebrate how gorgeous your names are, and having that moment as well. But basically, I was struck as much by the Du Bois quote as the Jefferson racism. It's like, how does it feel to be a problem? And it's like, that's devastating has the potential to be devastating with Black children in the classroom. Every time you talk about race, it's time for me to be a problem again. It's time for where we talk about me being weak again. It's time for me to talk about, it's time for that moment where I have to make my white teacher feel better, or my white classmates feel safer. It's that time where I have to be upset. It's that time where I have to, it becomes, it's February, so I have to be a problem this month, because everything we do is going to present me as a problem. Even my victories are presented as a problem. We celebrate Black firsts, the first Black person to play in the major leagues, the first Black person to do this, the first Black person to do that. And that's always the lens. It's always a problematic lens. We keep injecting white people into stories about Black people. And what are ways that minorities can be measured on their own terms and celebrated on their own terms without having to deal with and how they overcame white people.
And I'm just fences itself. I'm trying to remember. I don't even know if there are any white people in the play.
Not that I'm aware of, no.
So your answer about amplifying the humanity kind of anticipates my next question. A really helpful thing in your book that I think is both practically helpful, but also maybe existentially helpful is tying. You talk about tying race conversations to larger questions. So like family. So you're a unit on family, and then you would say, well, how does race affect family? as opposed to just, all right, we're going to talk about race today. And on 91, this is the way you put it that I thought was beautiful, and I think overcomes a dichotomy that we often run into. So you say race issues are human issues. And I'm thinking of how some people say, let's not talk about race. Let's focus on our humanity. And then so the answer is that, well, no, we can't ignore race. But you could swing the pendulum too far. And so your answer is, yes, let's talk about humanity. And one of the aspects of humanity is race. So let's talk about that too, as we're talking about these other things. So I thought that was really helpful.
Well, yeah, I think it's not like I'm. That was when I was writing that chapter, I was trying to choose my words as carefully as possible, because I'm not trying to like all lives matter race conversations. Like, I'm not trying to say, I'm not silencing the idea that we have to talk about racism. We have to talk about the very specific struggles that happen with minorities in the country. We absolutely have to speak about that. But I argue that we do a disservice when we when we isolate race conversations as if they're their own separate part of our human experience. In fact, they color every part of our human experience. Like, we cannot tell an honest story about America without weaving race throughout every single year of it. Like, it's impossible. But if we separate race out, then we get to deify founding fathers. Then we get to talk about our political systems and economic systems absent what they've done to brown people. Because we know we're about to get to brown people when we get to Brown People Month or Brown People Week or Brown People, that we know that we are about to deal with it. And so we get the luxury of just moving on as if nothing happened. And that's the language I was trying to get at. Time will tell to see if I actually got there. But what I was trying to say is we can't be siloed. We can't segregate race conversations. In fact, they should be in our curriculum all year. Like, if we should speak about gender and sexuality all year. We should talk about race all year. We should speak about economic issues all year. We should speak about all these things all year, and that's our challenge as teachers. That's what I'm trying to get at, I think. And I think you can't have an honest human conversation, especially one that deals with anything that happened in the past 1,000 years, and not discuss the concept of race that we have created and that we have allowed to run a great portion of our society and our personal lives. You can't have a human conversation without talking about race. It's impossible.
Race is not the whole conversation, but it's in every part of the conversation.
Yeah.
So it seems you're teaching English at a high school.
Yeah.
And so your examples throughout the book come from that context, from that subject and that education level. But I'm wondering, I find 90% of what you say directly applicable in the college context.
That's what my wife says. she's like, oh, I wish I had read this in college. I was like, that's very nice.
Well, yeah. I mean, I had that same thought. I'm thinking back over the race conversations I've tried to lead over the last 10 years that I've taught. I thought, my goodness, if I had this book at the beginning. Of course, you hadn't written it yet. But I'm wondering if you have some thoughts on the broader applicability of what you have to say in this book beyond high school and beyond English.
I think that it could be. Its easiest application just is humanities courses, just because it's the examples I use. I try to stay in my wheelhouse. Like, I don't want to talk about things I don't know that much about. I'm sure that there are applications in science and mathematics and stuff, but I wasn't going to get into the business of creating examples about things I didn't know about. But So I think the easiest application is, secondary humanities classes, middle and high school English and history classes. I think, but I think also different versions of this book could be written by people who know, like, I would love to read a version of this book that speaks about gender and sexuality. I would love to read a version of the book because my dad told me, I said, this is a book about communication. That's what you wrote. Like, you wrote about how to communicate about tough issues. And, I happen to know race. I happen to be conversant in race and read a lot on race. So that's the particular lens that and that's, I've been leading race conversations for a long time. So that's the angle I took. But I think that, things like listening and creating your authentic safe spaces and going after hard problems and threading your conversations, et cetera, those things seem almost universally applicable to any kind of heavy lift conversation. At least that's what I think. That's what I think I've done.
That's definitely how it feels to me. My next question. So as I'm reading your book, my question was to myself. I keep thinking, how does he know so much? How did he figure all this out? Is he just a genius?
Not at all.
And I suspect you may well be a genius, but when I got to the epilogue that I saw at least part of the answer, which is that you didn't just figure it out. You have for many years paid attention to collecting data in your classroom, data on what students are experiencing and on how the conversation actually goes. And you look at that data and you see what worked and what didn't, and then you make changes. So I just you didn't just guess, you researched, and I thought that was such an important point, that this is not Matt's opinions on how a good conversation goes. This isn't just Matt's genius, not just Matt's genius, but this is years of work and data to figure this out and build this pedagogy.
Yeah, I think probably. I come from teachers, so I respect the craft very much. I look at it like it's a craft. I work hard at it. Work hard at getting better. I'll say it that way. I remember my boss told me about my first year. He said, you can be you can be the same teacher that you are now for 30 years, and people are always going to say you're good. Or you can work hard and you can actually, like teachers, you get to a certain level of good and no one bugs you. Like no one's going to bug you ever because you're not a problem, and you can stay there forever and not get any better. And he said, like, you're there, like 22 years old, like you could be this person for the next 35 years and call it a career, and you do good work, or you can you can actually decide to grow. And that stuck in my head as one of the many driving factors of, like, it's not just enough to rest on natural talent. Like, there's a lot of people who have natural talent. There's nothing special about that. It's like, but can you listen to your students and, like, actually listen to them, actually look at what you did and look at what you do and try to, get better at it? And do you have the energy to be hard on yourself? Like, last year, I'm looking at my stuff. I'm going, man, that really didn't work last year. Those conversations didn't work. And I just wrote a book on conversations. Like, I could rest on that, but I'm still looking at conversations like, well, that was terrible. That didn't work at all. But I think it comes from, and I tried to make it clear in the book, that this idea of just magic teachers is destructive. I'm not just thinking about folks like me. I'm thinking about folks who, I'm you know, when I'm not tired, I'm exhausted now, but I could be pretty charismatic in the classroom. I can be, you know, I was the young teacher shouting around and running around and doing all that stuff. And, and, but I don't, at 35, I don't want to do all that anymore. You know, I have to have gotten better, and it's the same thing, you know, but if you're not, you know, if success only looks like that high energy, charismatic, natural in conversation, et cetera, then there's a lot of people who will be turned off and they'll never even try, because they'll say, I'm not like that teacher over in room 300. I'm not like that teacher over in, you know, I'll never be cool. I'll never be loud. I'll never be this. And if that's what it takes to have a good conversation about race that kids are interested in, I'm out. I'm not going to do it. And I think that's destructive, because we need as many good people in the game as possible. Not just those who self-identify as like iconoclastic, charismatic, you know, spark plugs. We need folks who are just like quiet and centered, and we're both, you know, not showy, and just let the kids do their thing.
So one thing that has stuck with me in the book and stood out is your story about the student Alex who comes to you, and so his concern is that other students have been calling him racist, and other things, and there's just so much about that story that I appreciate. One, it demonstrates the power of trust and community. So the student who has whatever ideas got him called racist is probably opposed to you politically in some ways, and probably knows that, and yet found you a safe person to talk to because of how you teach. And I think the advice you give the student is top notch. That he needs to understand why his classmates are reacting to him the way he is. And instead of just shutting up and keeping quiet, it'd probably be good for him to try to navigate that so he can communicate himself in a better way, which even more thoughtfully. So I thought I liked that. And I thought it was interesting how you make sure not to ask him what the specific views that got him called racist were, because you didn't want to put yourself in the position of deciding whether or not it was. And then you distinguish between things that are like not necessarily racist, and then absolutely racist. So the example you give is, if somebody thinks the southern border of the US is too porous, that might be rooted in racism, but not necessarily. But if they talk about illegal aliens, use that derogatory language, then that's out of bounds. So what I'm wondering as I'm reading the story of Alex, is what do you do when in a class conversation somebody presents a position that maybe has this veneer of plausible deniability, like, oh, that's not racist, and maybe they didn't intend it that way, but it absolutely has racist implications, like slavery was so long ago, people need to get over it, or we need to be tougher on crime. So maybe that's not coming from a place of hate, but you carry that out, and brown people are getting hurt by those ideas. So what do you do when those kinds of ideas come up in class discussion?
Well, we can take the two examples you just gave. Slavery was so long ago, why do people care about it, or something like that. And the second one was, we need to do something about crime, or something like that. The first one's racist, because it's what I use. And of course, I'm not the arbiter of what's racist and what's not. It's just my opinion, which I'm open with the kids about. But it's pretty solid that, in the classroom, we care about each other's well-being. And that's our goal. We don't always get there, but we're trying really hard to care about people's well-being. That statement, when said, almost every single time it's being said, is being said to hurt. You hear someone discussing very clearly why they think that why slavery still impacts the society today, and maybe them, and then you hear that and you say, no, it doesn't. I find it very hard to hear that phrase and not think it's driven by racism, which leads to the follow-up conversation, or what do you do when a kid says something racist, right? And now the second one, I think, falls into the other category of you don't know where it comes from. Everyone needs to calm down and have the conversation. There's a book I'm reading now called Locking Up Our Own. James Farmer, I think, his son. He wrote this book. I'm looking it up now. Yeah, James Foreman wrote this book called Locking Up Our Own, and it's about majority Black legal system in Washington, D.C. getting tough on crime, and the implications of, like, how come Black people, we tend to think about mass incarceration as far as something white people did to Black people, but what happens when Black people internalize essentially racist ideas and combine that with very real fears and environmental changes and stuff. And especially when you put that into a society, the only reason ghettos exist is racist. Like, there are layers upon layers upon layers to that conversation. Anyone who wants to speak about toughness on crime, that's a full-on conversation, and we should probably remove for a second our hypersensitivity towards any complexity there, especially when discussing. Oftentimes, the people who are angriest at violent crime in the neighborhoods are the minorities who live there. And so that's actually, it's a bit of a red herring to speak about how white people feel about violent crime, when generally the people who are actually change agents and voting these big city mayors and DAs in are Black people. One mayor ago in Philadelphia, that guy was elected on stop and frisk. Like, he ran on stop and frisk, and the majority Black city voted on him, voted him for stop and frisk. So that's complicated. But I hear, even in those two examples, two different conversations. The biggest thing is, are you trying to engage ideas, like the second one is, or are you trying to hurt, like the first one is? And I think I have a very strong ear, especially working with teenagers, with statements that are said to hurt, or said, even if they aren't intending to hurt, the person who originally says it is to hurt. So even if they're parroting someone, and like the kid doesn't have, because the kids, are often parroting what they hear someone else say, but the person they're parroting was trying to hurt, then that's where I tend to draw hard lines. And, I speak in very hard lines. You can't say that. Can't say that here. Can't say that anywhere. Don't say that anymore. That's racist. No, let's move on. But with things, I think the crime example is probably a really good one of something where more progressive folks can be shut down by their hypersensitivity. Like, we want our kids to have this kind of honest discourse about crime and punishment in Black communities. I think it's a worthwhile conversation.
I love your answer, because it's complicating my thinking. So I obviously gave both examples as if they were the same kind of thing. So that you're saying there are some things that are meant to hurt, or that have been said to meant to hurt, even if the student isn't saying it now, that you just say, no, we don't say that here. And then there are other things that we watch out being sensitive to that, and we say, well, let's unpack the ideas here. So I guess my follow-up question is, how do you determine which are which? Since even just now, I had assumed both of those were on one side of a line.
Well, you listen super carefully. Like, you really have to listen aggressively. Like, you have to listen. Someone at one of my presentations came up to me afterwards and talked about jazz musicians. I don't know much about playing instruments, but he said, when he learned how to play music, he was taught to listen assertively to the other people. Like, you have to, in order to really vibe with them, you got to really listen very carefully to everything that someone is saying. And part of that is I really try my best to not formulate my response at all while someone is still speaking, and try to train my kids not to do that, and to hear, and so that you can hear what someone is saying and put your brain, like, really roll it around on your tongue in your brain before you respond. So you can see, like, the difference between those two statements, or you can play. What I probably did without being aware was play out a thought experiment. Like, I probably did a thought experiment about how would that conversation go, and say, well, the first one's ahistorical. You could probably push it very quickly. If someone says, for example, why are you talking about slavery? I'd first probably check them on their tone, because just the phrasing of that means I'm hearing whatever conversation happened before. I'm hearing that statement is phrased like it's a reaction to something, like someone spoke before that statement. It's not the first thing. And so if someone spoke before that statement, what did they say? And it sounds to me snide, like it was a response to something that was said. If it's not the response to something that was said, and it's spoken like, I want to know, why are we still talking about slavery? That's an answer that can happen very quickly. Like, you can speak very quickly about the generational legacy of slavery. And it has almost a factual answer. Like, it's not even opinions. It's like, and so, but I think to be reflective on it, I probably heard in your saying, one of them sounds like the beginning of a conversation about crime and punishment, and the other one sounds like it was a reaction to something someone else said. So I probably played it out and heard my students, like, if that came out of one of my students' mouth, what happened before that to make them say that? But it all happens from listening, and then for having the conversation so many times that you get used to the different permutations that happen, which is good if you're having race chats whenever available and whenever prudent, whenever it makes sense. That way, it's not like the one of 3 race conversations you have all year, so you don't have a chance to get good at it. But there's very little that a kid can say during a race conversation that I haven't heard some version of. And there's very few exchanges that happen that I don't know where it could go or what could spark it. Well, if someone says this, someone else says, because I've had so many of them. So that's why I encourage teachers to have them all the time so they can get good at it. It's not that I'm particularly that smart. It's that I've had the conversation so many times that, like, all of those conversations in the book are composites. Like, it's one kid speaking, and I taught them in 2006, and one kid I taught in 2012, and they're in a conversation with each other because I remember the exchanges. And so it's like what they said that one year. It's like what they said that one year. We'll put them all in the room together, and we'll that comes from having so many of the conversations that you can plug and play.
Your book is split into 2 halves. The first half is the kind of laying out principles, and then the second half, like you're just referring to, is these replaying and then analysis of conversations you've actually had that are composites. And what I really like about that second half, I mean, the writing is just incredible. I'm just there in the room while it's happening, so it really brings the principles to life. But an additional thing that this richness of narrative offers is it shows some things that you're doing that hadn't necessarily mentioned in the principles, but that as I see the narratives, I see, oh, that looks important. So one of those things, it seems like your conversations are very carefully structured. Like, I'm going to ask this question, and then I'm going to ask this question, and then I'm going to ask this question, and then I'm going to pull in this video clip. Like, you've got it planned out in terms of what topics or what questions you're going to ask and what resources you're going to pull in. Am I just projecting that, or am I seeing that? Is that important in your planning?
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, some things, like with all teachers, we have like some days where it's like super structured. Like, I'm going to ask this in a conversational class. Some days I'm just teaching writing or we're just reviewing the book. But if it's a conversation, then some days it's like I want them to get here, so there's a prompt that's meant to get them there, and if they start wavering, then I'll push them back, in the conversation gently. I'll nudge it back to where I want it to go. And then sometimes it's like the lesson is just to explore an idea, which is partly why you have to keep doing something new, because you only have that explore idea conversation a few times before it becomes a formula again, because you've done it so many times that you know where they're going to go, and then you start finding yourself just leading them back to the coolest version of that. Like, it's like, oh, that happened really great 2 years ago. I want to have that conversation again. That was fun. So that's why you keep having to do new stuff and do new sources, so that you can keep having just straight up exploring conversations. But I have like anchor things, like even in those looser ones, I'll say, we're going to show them this clip. And when they see this clip about blackface, they're going to probably notice this, this, and this. And then it'll say in bullet points on my plan, ask them what they think about this. And it'll just be like, and it'll be anchored to the clip, anchored to the text, anchored to the essential question. Those are the three things that'll normally anchor it. Like the source, the text, the essential questions or themes. That's how I keep with the thread, like from chapter 2 or 3. That's chapter 3. That's how I keep with the thread. Like, you keep anchoring it so it's not just a free for all. It keeps going back to the essential questions of the unit, back to the themes of the unit, or back to the text, back to the outside of resource. But yeah, it depends. Sometimes it's super structured. Sometimes it's kind of, I'm going to show the kids something cool and see what they think about it, as long as it relates to the EQ.
So I have one or two more questions for you. One is that I'm teaching a course right now, or co-teaching it with my colleague Ray Allen, called Dialogue and Diversity, in which, in fact, we've shared your book with the students there. I typed up your page on getting to the next question and brought that in. We've used that. But the purpose of the course is to dialogue about diversity related issues. In fact, we've picked, or the students picked, this. Do you know this book? It's what we're using as kind of the main,
no, I don't.
The main text for our discussion. It's I'm Still Here: Black Dignity in a World Made for Whiteness by Austin Channing Brown.
Okay.
So we're talking about that, and then we're studying dialogue itself. So we have the conversation, and then we step back and think about, how did that go? So my question is, if you were going to share a message with my students who are studying dialogue, what would you tell them?
Studying dialogue, like
studying dialogue, discussion, conversation, how to have these meaningful discussions.
That's a good question. I think probably if they're studying, they're studying their own exchanges, like their own conversations. I think to track it for evidence of listening, to track it for how connected they have, for focus, for how connected they've stayed to a certain thread of conversation, or have they started to stray into their own thing. Track it for things like, are you sermonizing? Have people started to sermonize and stop policing their voice? Track it for additions to the conversation, like how often did we build off of each other's points, as far as, instead of just repeating? How often did we challenge each other's points instead of just repeating? How are we using evidence to back up our opinions, the things we say? Stuff like that, I think, is where I would start.
I love it. Thanks. My last question is just, is there anything else that you'd like to say about this book or this topic that I haven't asked you yet?
Not really, no. I mean, I'm happy that you are finding it useful. But and you know, I'm so far so good as far as the response I'm feeling. I just wanted to write something that teachers would find useful. And so I think sounds like I've done that. So that makes me feel good.
Oh, absolutely. I read a lot on teaching, or at least a lot for me. And this is and have for some years. And this is just one of the best books that I've read. In terms of, I mean, how important it is, how insightful it is, how clear the writing is in terms of laying out specific concrete examples. It's just an exceptional book. So I'm going to keep plugging it, and I hope others will read it and get as much out of it as I have.
I appreciate that.
So that's it then. Thank you so much for chatting with me.
Yeah, no problem.
Oh, actually, before we go, I did want to ask you, are you working on another book?
No, no. I've gotten a couple requests from people say, when's the next thing happening? And I'm like, in a long time.
Okay. Well, I'll be waiting. Add my name to that list.
Yeah, it's a lot of work. I got it done just in time, so I'm gonna rest on this one for a while.
You've earned it.
Yeah.
All right, Matt. So long.
All right. Have a good one.